my name is Tracy Lee Thornton, and today I'm going to talk to you about strategies for ethical decision making in healthcare. By the end of this unit, I want you to be able to assimilate basic theories and approaches in ethical decision making in healthcare, and then I want you to apply this knowledge with role-playing and case study scenarios. So our ethics unit learning objectives: upon completing this unit with 80% accuracy on a written examination, I would like for you to be able to compare and contrast common bioethical terminology. I also want you to be able to identify strategies for how you can continue to develop your ethical behaviors. I want you to be able to analyze a decision-making model that can be used to determine appropriate action when encountering ethical dilemmas. I also want you to collaborate on an ethical situation and provide feedback on possible resolutions. Then I want you to be able to classify categories of ethical issues in healthcare. And finally, to perform role-playing for a given case study in order to identify ethical situations and support a resolution. So some resources I want you to be aware of for ethics. The American Physical Therapy Association that you have access to has all of the standards of ethical conduct. It also has a guide for conduct, the core values, and the code of ethics. So that can help guide you in decision making and ethics as well. Also, Holly Clinch's textbook, The Role of the Physical Therapist Assistant, she does have many resources in that text for ethical decision making. Nancy Kirsch as well, Ethics in Physical Therapy. She does a case-based approach, which is what we're trying to do in this lecture, is to try to get you to role play so that you can learn how to deal with ethical situations. And finally, Swisher et al. Is the one who developed the model for decision making that we're going to be going over today. So let's start this with a collaboration, some class discussion. So I want to go over a situation and just, see how you feel about it. So Helen has just left the office of a local orthopedic surgeon. Now, when she went there, she wanted to illustrate her positive outcomes. She's doing great things with her patients, and she wanted this doctor to know that so that he would start sending her more referrals. About halfway through, she realized that he was not interested in her outcomes. He actually hinted at needing a gift, so some local tea times at the local country club. So Helen left there thinking, am I being naive? Should I just play the game? So let's take a moment and think about this. Would you consider this to be an ethical situation? Okay, how many of you would say this is actually an ethical situation? Okay, do any of you feel like there's not any ethics at play here? Okay, so we do all agree there is an ethical situation involved. So tell me, who do you think is affected by this ethical situation? Okay, somebody said Helen, and that's right, she is directly affected. Are there any other players in this? The doctor, yes. Yeah, I heard somebody say that her patients, her business practice, her employees, and then somebody else said our whole profession. That's a very good answer because we're looking at ethics that could affect more than just Helen or her business practice. So let's talk about what would you do if you were Helen. Okay, so she's saying back there that what she would do is she would not give the bribe, and then she would just continue to show her outcomes and maybe talk to other orthopedic surgeons to try to get those referrals. Anybody else have a different point of view? Okay, I do appreciate your honesty. So what he said was, he thinks he might play the game. He's got to feed his family, so he's going to give those tea times so he can get referrals and stay in business. So what are the consequences of these choices? Okay, so the first choice Helen makes to not give the gift, maybe she goes out of business because she doesn't have enough referrals. Okay, what about what he was saying about taking and giving the gifts? Right, people may find out that she has an unethical practice and word gets out and she may not get referrals because of that and end up having to shut down anyway. So think about this. How will your decision, if you're Helen, impact your patients, your organization, the profession, and even your whole community. Okay? So it doesn't just have ramifications for you as an individual. Now, when we talk about how we begin to frame our ethical decision making, we want to base this on a model. And the model I want to go over today is called the Ritz Model of Ethical Decision Making. And this was developed by Swisher et al. It was adopted by the American Physical Therapy Association as a guide for therapists to follow. I have included the chart here so you can see the whole model together, but we're going to go through each part of this Ritz model. So the first part is the R. That's our realm. Okay, so who is affected? It can be an individual, just like we said with Helen. It could also be organizational or institutional. But it could also affect the greater society, the community, the profession, and other entities as well. Let's talk about how the three realms are related. So they are interdependent. So as the complexity of an ethical situation increases, you start to move out of that individual realm and you start to affect those other realms. And even though we should be able to pinpoint which realm is the most important, the other ones are also affected by decisions that are made. The second part of the Ritz model is the individual process. So there are 4 ways to look at the individual process. One is through moral sensitivity. So with moral sensitivity, you want to be able to recognize, interpret, and frame that ethical situation. The second individual process is called moral judgment. So that is deciding right versus wrong, being able to analyze a situation and make that appropriate decision. The next individual process is called moral motivation. With moral motivation, we are going to value those ethical values over other values that are at play. And finally, we have moral courage. And moral courage means we implement and take action no matter what the barriers are to this action. So now let's talk about the S part of RIPS. That would be the ethical situation. So those are different. And a lot of times people say, oh, I have a dilemma. Not every ethical situation is a dilemma, and we're going to learn about the differences in these situations. So the first one is an ethical conflict. This is when your values, your goals, your duties, they are in conflict or challenged by the situation. And you're not really sure which action to take. So the waters are really muddy and it's not really clear what the best thing to do. So that would be an ethical conflict. Another one is an ethical dilemma. In an ethical dilemma, there are 2 or more clear pathways or principles or values that are the correct course of action. However, taking one has negative consequences for the other. Okay? So you can't avoid the conflict of the 2 unless you find a way to compromise and find an alternative third way. You also have what's called ethical distress. So you know the right thing to do, but there are organizational constraints that are barriers to you making that decision. Okay? So what's an example of that? Let's say that your rehab director wants you to see 22 patients a day for your productivity standards, but you know when you go over 15 patients, you're not giving that same quality of care. So this would be an ethical distress for you because you know what the right thing to do is, but you're getting pressure from your organization to do something different. We also have what's called ethical temptation. It is a clear choice of right versus wrong. However, you may stand to benefit from making the wrong choice. Remember Helen? So Helen could get more referrals if she were to make the wrong choice. So her situation was in fact an ethical temptation. Finally, we have what's called ethical silence. In ethical silence, those ethical values are being challenged, but nobody speaks up. We say, this is not my problem, I don't want to know about it, I'm going to stay out of it. But if you know there's an ethical situation going on and you're silent about it, then you're part of the problem as well. Now that we've broken down the parts of the RIPS model, how do we this model in order to make good ethical decisions? First of all, we have to recognize and define the ethical issue. That means we want to gather all the facts. There are more than one side of the issue, more than two sides, sometimes more than three sides. So we want to hear who has an interest in the issue. And we want to take this information and use it to figure out who is affected in the realm, what individual process should be used, and then what type of situation are we dealing with. So again, with the realm, it's who is affected the most. And we said that could be individual, organizational, or society. With the individual process, there's going to be one that stands out. It's either going to be moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, or moral courage. And finally, we have to choose what type of ethical situation we're dealing with. Is it a conflict, a dilemma, a distress, a temptation, or a silence? In step 2, we're going to reflect on the situation. So we're going to think about what are some alternatives for action, and do these alternatives bring about good for other people, or could they cause more harm? You know, we might need to attempt to change our own behavior or help change someone else's behavior. Or maybe the change needs to come at the organizational level, like our example earlier, as far as number of patients to be seen. And sometimes you may have to advocate to change an unjust law because it's on that higher level. Then we say, okay, are we really dealing with a right versus wrong issue or a right versus right? And there are several ways that we can discern that. First of all, there's a legal test. Is it illegal? And what do we go back to that? We go back and look at our State Practice Act. What do our rules and regulations say about our profession and our practice? And if it's against our State Practice Act, it is not a true dilemma. It's just a hard choice to make, but there's only one right choice in this situation. There's also what's called a stench test. So that's when you get that feeling deep down in your gut that something is not right. Another test is called the mom test. So if I were my mother, would I be doing this? And then the front page test. So if the Hattiesburg American published this tomorrow on the front page, am I okay with that? Next, we're going to look at a right versus right issue, okay? So we can usually classify healthcare ethical dilemmas into 4 paradigms. Usually we're choosing truth versus loyalty, self versus community, short-term versus long-term, and then justice versus mercy. Okay. So in step 3, we're going to have to make a decision. And there are 3 approaches in this model to making decisions. The first one is definitely rule-based. So with the rules, we follow our rules, our duties, our obligations, those ethical principles that I talked about in the resources earlier that are all published on that website for the APTA. So that is a rule-based way to make decisions. Ends-based is when we determine what are the consequences if we make an alternative plan. Will it harm people or will it do more good? And finally, we have what's called care-based. So we resolve dilemmas according to our relations and concerns for others. That could be our patients, that could be our co-workers. So that is a care-based approach. Once we make a decision, we implement our plan, and then we're going to evaluate the outcomes of the action. And then we want to really honestly assess so we can do better in the future every time we have to make decisions. Now, some of the types of healthcare some types of ethical problems that healthcare workers face: patients' rights, patient welfare concerns, professional issues, and business economic issues. Okay? And then there are 4 key bioethical principles we usually face in healthcare as well. Those are beneficence, which is doing what is best or right; non-maleficence, which is doing no harm to the patient; autonomy, which is allowing the patient to make informed decisions; and justice, so providing fairness to all. So now we're going to role play. Each group has been given an ethical scenario, and you're going to perform your scenario up here. During each performance, I want you to think about the Ritz model in relation to your scenario, those bioethical principles being violated, and the type of issue that it represents. Okay? So our first one, we're ready to go with group 1 to come up and do their role play scenario.